Hi there, and welcome to HR Live for this week. For many businesses, the dominating headlines of the day is low unemployment and high inflation. While some businesses are out there desperately looking for staff to cater for heightened demand, other businesses are in the process of carrying out restructuring and redundancy processes in an effort just to survive. Our experience on the ground in the HR and workplace relations space tells us that we're really facing a two-speed business environment. We spent a lot of time on the stream talking about the challenges in the recruitment market. And today we wanted to unpack the other side of the coin and offer some insights and common mistakes that businesses make when carrying out redundancy processes. To help us with this, once again, we're joined by On Demand HR Managing Director Clint Indrell, who has a wealth of experience in these matters. So welcome to HR Live once again, Clint.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andrew. Great to be here.
Fantastic. My name, for those of you that don't know, is Andrew Kalita. I'm the Operations Director of On Demand HR. And HR Live is, of course, the weekly live show where we take a HR or workplace relations challenge that's impacting businesses, we unpack it, and we offer some tips, tricks, and strategies that businesses can adopt in order to navigate through. HR Live is also a fantastic opportunity for any of you to put forward questions around HR or workplace relations that your business is facing. And of course, if we can, we'll try to answer them live on the stream. However, if there's a bit more to unpack, we'll cover the topic in a future session, or alternatively, we also give you an opportunity to schedule a free HR consultation supported by a strategic action plan with one of our experienced HR consultants. So before we dig into this week's content, I've dug around on the internet and come up with a few clips that I wanted to share with you from the 2009 movie Up in the Air with George Clooney that I think really going to set the scene around some of the mistakes and challenges faced by employers when they're carrying out redundancy processes. To give you a little bit of context about the movie and why we're sharing it with you, George Clooney's character in the movie travels around the USA carrying out redundancies on behalf of companies. So let's cut to the clip now.
So although I wish I were here with better news, the fact is that you and I are sitting here today because this will be your last week of employment at this company.
Why me?
What am I supposed to do now?
Am I supposed to feel better that I'm not the only one losing my job?
This is ridiculous. I have been a fine employee for over 10 years, and this is the way you treat me.
This is what I get in return for 30 years of service for my company, and they send some yo-yo like you in here to try to tell me that I'm out of a job. They should be telling you you're out of a job.
I can't afford to be unemployed. I have a house payment. I have children.
I don't know how you can live with yourself, but I'm sure that you'll find a way while the rest of us are suffering.
I'm done.
I wasn't expecting this. Not at all.
Just like that?
I'm disappointed that I've given so much of my life.
This is not fair.
So now that we're all in the mood, and before we get into talking about what a robust and compliant redundancy process looks like, unlike what we just saw, let's take a look at some of the payment obligations provided for under the NES for redundancy. So, Clint, do you want to talk us through what the obligations are?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Before I get into that, one thing I thought was really interesting in that clip was that one of the particular persons being terminated spoke about the yo-yo, George Clooney being a yo-yo coming in, bouncing in and out to do this process. And look, one thing I say before I get into the obligations is that I do think it's very important for businesses to own the decision. I do think it's actually better that obviously the owner of the business or the GM or whoever it may be owns the decision that is made rather than bringing in an external consultant for that. I think the place of the external consultant is to advise on the process, obviously provide documentation associated with the process and that is required under the Modern Award and under the Fair Work Act to discuss all the areas of risk. But I think the delivery should be done by the person ultimately in the business. Otherwise, it does come across as not very genuine. So just an interesting point picked up on there from the movie. Moving on to the payments under the Fair Work Act. So essentially, look, Section 119 of the Fair Work Act sets out the minimum payments for redundancy pay which applies to essentially any business that's 15 or more of employees. So you can see there's a scale. Look, I'm not going to read it out line by line, but basically it goes up every single year until it gets to the 10-year mark, and it actually then goes down from 16 weeks after 9 years and then 12 weeks after 10 years. Look, I continue to think that this is a little bit strange because the idea when this came into being was that pro rata long service leave, that long service leave would kick in after 10 years. But in so many states, pro rata long service leave kicks in before 10 years anyway. So you are literally better off being made redundant after 9 years than you are after 10, almost in all circumstances. So look, a little bit strange that the scale is like that. It should be at least 16 weeks after 10 years, but that's ultimately how the scale was created. It was created out of some test cases, which were actually in the mid-2000s, and that's how it came into being in the Fair Work Act, which was established in 2009. There is also, it's important to note that redundancy pay and notice are two separate concepts. So notice is your standard notice of termination that applies for any reason for termination. And ultimately, again, that's based on a scale, which is, as you can see there, a much simpler scale of 4 different time categories with 4 different notice periods. There's also an obligation to provide an additional week if a person's over 45 and has 2 years of service. So again, the 2 requirements are there. Notice can actually be worked or paid in lieu. So with some redundancies, you see people will work the notice period up to an end date, and then they're simply paid their redundancy pay at the end. In other redundancies, you would say, we're going to pay redundancy pay and we don't require you to work the notice period, hence the payment of the notice. But I think what we'll get into a little bit later, Andrew, is obviously talking about the fact that just because you pay redundancy pay and just because you pay notice, that doesn't buy you out of the potential risks of redundancy and certain claims. And we can talk a little bit more about that later.
Yeah, fantastic. And just in terms of, before we move into that section of today's session, you mentioned around, I guess this is the redundancy notice pay for businesses that have more than 15 employees. Do you want to share a little bit about, I guess, what's classified under the Fair Work Act as a small business, and basically how this changes, or how the pay rates change for small businesses that have less than 15 employees?
Yeah, sure. So look, the only thing that really changes is that the redundancy pay, so the top half of that slide you have in front of you, that doesn't apply to businesses less than 15 employees. Less than 15 is the important thing. 15, you're captured. Less than 15, you're not. There are some modern awards that still require redundancy pay for small employers. So we're defining a small employer as basically less than 15. There is some modern awards that still require redundancies, but most modern awards won't. So in most circumstances, I'd probably say at least 90% of circumstances, if you are a small employer, you won't have to pay redundancy pay. However, you will still need to follow the same notice scale as outlined at the bottom of that particular slide. And in terms of the obligations and risks, the obligations and risks are relatively similar in small as they are in larger businesses.
Fantastic. And just before, again, we move on, I know there's a couple of, and probably a question without notice, but I know there's a couple of quirks when it comes to, I guess, calculation of these redundancy pays. And what I'm talking about here are things like it needs to be a certain, the period is indicated in the table in terms of continuous service. And, I think a lot of people come up with questions like, does maternity leave, for example, break the continuous service? Is there anything that can, if the business is considering redundancy, basically break the period of continuous service for the calculations of redundancy pay in accordance with the table we can see on our screen now?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, parental leave is the most common one that comes up. What happens with parental leave is that essentially, the period doesn't break the continuous service, and ultimately the person would still be entitled to redundancy pay for their service. Now, obviously, what we have to factor into the calculations is whether there is a deduction, and those deductions are different for different entitlements. So what we find is that there may be a separate rule for long service leave than there would be for redundancy pay than there would be for notice. So we normally look at those on each and every occasion just to check what the circumstances are in relation to those things, and before giving guidance to a client on those things. But ultimately, parental leave being the most common one doesn't break the continuity of service. Person doesn't have to start again for the purposes of entitlements. And then we look at each and every entitlement and what's required in relation to those scenarios.
Awesome. And as you mentioned, just because a business pays what their requirements are under the Fair Work Act in terms of entitlements, being the redundancy pay, the notice period, long service leave, and any other payments that may require, doesn't necessarily mean that that business is exempt from facing an unfair dismissal claim on procedural grounds. Procedural fairness is obviously another key consideration for the Commission. And as we can see on our screen now, we have worked out over the years through a little bit of trial and error, a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of experience in representing businesses in the Commission when it comes to unfair dismissal cases, what we consider to be a fairly robust redundancy process. So do you want to walk us through the steps and what's involved here and why we do it this way?
Yeah, sure. Look, I guess before we even head this off, I mean, obviously, I think you probably downplayed a little bit the number of redundancies that On-Demand HR has carried out. I mean, we've carried out hundreds of these restructuring and redundancy processes to the extent that this is absolute bread and butter stuff for us now. And we've seen, good processes, bad processes, and everything in between. But really, in the last few years, we've been really going to clients with this is how the process must happen, rather than obviously giving some guidance and letting them have input, but really making sure that they fit within the certain framework that we recommend. And I'll talk through that framework now. So ultimately, look, the Fair Work Act and the modern awards require there to be consultation prior to redundancies. And consultation is not just telling the person what is going to happen. It's about influencing the decision maker, being obviously the employer in this particular situation. So as an absolute minimum process, the first step we always recommend is that there be an initial consultation meeting. And that is to say to the employee in question that, look, a definite decision has been made to restructure. Your position is going to be affected. These are the business reasons for our restructure. And then we talk about, okay, your current position is affected. Now we have to look at whether or not there is an alternative position or whether or not we make you redundant. And that's obviously a decision that happens later in the second and or the final meeting. What we would also recommend being issued at or after the consultation meeting is what we call an initial consultation letter. And that letter covers the business reasons, confirms what was said in the first meeting, but also provides information for the employee. And one of the modern award requirements around restructuring is that information is provided. So this is one way we think tick that information box by providing that initial consult letter. We would then observe a period of, look, it can vary, but typically between 4 to 7 days would be the period we would recommend. And in that time, the employee would be considering, okay, are there any other positions that I am considering applying for and or expressing interest for? Or alternatively, if there isn't, I'm just waiting for the process to play out while the employer considers if there are any other options. So we do see some employers will have alternative positions available for the person to apply, and they don't have to be positions of the same nature. They can be positions that are less in status, less in pay, or higher in status and higher in pay. And look, I guess it comes down to the suitability of the employee to take on that other role. So that's what they would generally consider during that consult period, and they'd liaise with the employer as needed to discuss those things. You would probably also want to offer the employee access to an employee assistance program at that time, which is just a counselling service ultimately to assist them with any, unhappiness or, mental health considerations during that particular time. So those are, I guess, the first three things that we'd be doing. I guess once we sort of understand the intentions of the employee in respect to any alternative positions, or if there are no alternative positions and we haven't come up with anything else, then we'd have a second meeting, as I said, 4 to 7 days after the first, where we either confirm that there are no other alternatives, that redundancy, that the final decision is redundancy, or alternatively, it could be to confirm, look, you've applied for this other role, we're happy for you to take on this other role, or it could be to subject them to some sort of interviewing process for another role. So that would mean that the person would potentially have 2 or 3 meetings in that situation. You might have an interview meeting or suitability for role meeting, and then followed by a final meeting. So it's not always 2 meetings. It could be 3, it could be 4, but in our experience, most of the time it's 2 meetings, probably 80% of the time it would be that. And then the second or final letter would basically confirm that the employment has been made redundant, and that would outline payments and timeframes for those payments. It could also include an offer of, the EAP services and also outplacement services. That's another great thing to offer as an employer to employees when they're really looking about their future. They're looking about, okay, well, what am I going to need to do to get another job? And I really find outplacement services are great in the sense that they will have an employee focus on the future rather than focusing on, this employer did the wrong thing by me, and really looking back at the past. So I'm a big fan of outplacement services. And just a shout out to Deborah Manson from Deborah Manson Recruitment and Training. She does a great job at this sort of stuff for our clients, and we've found it very effective in terms of assisting the employee to move on, but also as a risk management tool as well.
Fantastic. And one of the questions that that sort of come to my mind as you were speaking through, I guess, what's a fairly, organization-led redundancy process? And what I mean by that is, I think a lot of larger organizations that I've heard, through the grapevine, they do tend to, when they're going through a restructuring process, offer voluntary redundancies. And do you have any experience or anything that you can share potentially that might, limit the adversarial nature of, or what could be an adversarial nature of a redundancy process that's company-led? Hey, you've been selected, you're going to be made redundant. Do you have any insights about voluntary redundancies that you can share?
I don't mind a voluntary redundancy when it's a single redundancy. So when it's a situation where there is discussion about the possibility of redundancy and the parties agree to a voluntary redundancy by way of a deed of release. So that I don't mind that sort of a redundancy. But in general, I'm not a big fan of voluntary redundancies, and I'll tell you why. Let's say we have 15 employees and, we're only going to retain 8 of them or 6 of them or however many we're going to retain. What I find is when you cast the net open for voluntary redundancies, what you'll often get is first of all, you lose control a little bit over who you want to keep. That's the first thing. I mean, you can put some controls around that, but again, if you're putting controls around it, well, you should already know who you want and who you don't want. But the other thing is that the more likely scenario is that your most capable people will put their hand up for the redundancy, take the money, and back themselves to go and get another job. And really, do you want your best talent flying out of the organization as a result of a redundancy process just because you kind of wanted to be a little bit nicer about it? I'm really not a fan of them at all, voluntary redundancy processes. I've seen them occur. I've seen them become a real mess. I've seen them, people are leaving and then others, poor performers, are staying. So look, no, I think that it is better to have a selection criteria to review all of the people. Obviously we're talking about larger redundancies here. Review all the people who are eligible or potentially could be made redundant, and select who's to stay and who's to go. And I know that's a little bit more, adversarial potentially, or forced. And sure, there might be questions about, why was this person picked over this person? But that shouldn't drive the business results and the commercial outcomes from the redundancy process. I mean, ultimately, look, the Fair Work Commission is going to look at the process. Has a fair selection criteria been adopted? Yes or no? And most of the time, if that's the case, well, if a management team looks at a set of employees and scores one over the other, well, unless there's some sort of problem with the criteria or it's discriminatory or something like that, those sort of business decisions are generally going to be respected. So look, I really think that as long as you've got a good criteria, I'm more of a fan of being in charge of your own destiny rather than leaving it up to the fate of 15 or 20 people who may accept the voluntary redundancy or not accept the voluntary redundancy for a variety of reasons.
Makes perfect sense to me. The other thought that came into my mind as you were speaking is obviously the process that you've shared today is very much centered around, I guess, from a compliance perspective and meeting with obligations under the Fair Work Act. And from my perspective, just thinking about this and trying to shift the paradigm a little bit and shifting over to the employee side, I guess a focus on meeting the compliance requirements almost forces a business when carrying out a restructuring process to think strategically about it and go through a process around communication. And it's one of those rare times, I wouldn't say rare, but one of the limited times whereby the focus on compliance and meeting with obligations actually probably limits the reality or the chance or the frustration of the employee, because it's so heavily focused around consultation, from getting upset in the process, whether it be rightly or wrongly, in the first place. So I think it kind of facilitates both sides of the arguments, the compliance, but also making sure that focusing on the compliance looks after the employee's interest and cares about them as an individual. And I think that works really well with the process that you've explained. Okay. Let's move on to the next slide. I know there's some other considerations around redundancies that we haven't covered yet. And basically, do you want to share some of these extra considerations that maybe not taking into account in every single redundancy or restructuring process, but from time to time, I think some of these things are very much valuable tools?
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, we already touched on the selection criteria, and look, that's something that should always be used when there's a possibility of a group of people being selected for redundancy. So, for example, if I've got 5 fitters and turners and I need to reduce that to 3, then realistically what I should be doing is, scoring those 5 people against a selection criteria and deciding who are the best, the best persons to remain employed. And that might be a combination of their on-the-job performance. It might be a combination of their qualifications, skills, experience, and so on, as to how that selection criteria is come up with. So, obviously it depends on the circumstances of each role. So that's something we recommend, and we work with a lot of clients on selection criteria and how to deal with those certain things. That will minimize risks of things like unfair dismissal. If a fair selection criteria has been used, it'd be much harder for an unfair dismissal process to occur. And not only that, you've got the redundancy process we outlined in the previous slide. So good selection criteria, good process will mitigate or minimize unfair dismissal risks. Looking at long service leave entitlements, look, most states will have provisions for, either the person's met their full long service leave entitlement or potentially pro rata long service leave entitlement. They are entitled to pro rata long service leave in New South Wales after 5 years. And if they're made redundant, they do get it in those circumstances. So that's just one example of the state-based long service leave systems and the entitlement upon redundancy. Looking at also alternative jobs, and the alternative jobs, as I said a little bit earlier in the session, they don't have to be the same jobs. They don't have to be similar. They can be completely different. I love sharing this story. We had a client a few years ago who had some salespeople in Australia, and basically they decided, look, this is not working out financially. They're not making the money that we need to facilitate these territories. We're going to actually make these roles redundant. And I got to talking with the client, and I said, well, look, do you have any other alternative roles? And the person in question said, well, in actual fact, we're going to be advertising roles in the United States for similar sales positions. We're going to reallocate the money there. So in the consultation process, we actually put to the employees that one of the alternatives was relocating to the United States to take on the role. Now, obviously, we knew that there was probably a 98% chance that they weren't going to take the role, but nonetheless, it went so far as to mitigate the risks of redundancy, because we were looking genuinely at what other options were available. Putting those things on the table certainly will help in mitigating those risks, even if it's unlikely the employees will take those roles. So that's a great little story about looking at alternative jobs and when to put them into a redundancy process. Look, the only other two things I would say is that, look, if you are going to offer more than the person would ordinarily be entitled to, I'd consider a deed of release just to make sure that there are no further claims post-employment. So that is something that organisations should definitely consider. It's basically a deed of release is a release agreement between an employer and an employee, which basically releases, both parties release each other from all claims. There's confidentiality and no disparagement provisions. So sometimes that can be good if people are worried about what a person's going to say after the employment's ended. Recently had a situation with that with one of our current clients. So that's quite important. The other thing is the offer of the support person. So we would always recommend that the person be offered a support person at the initial consult meeting and at the final meeting if it goes ahead. And that's something to assist with, again, the provisions of the Fair Work Act talks about the offering of a support person in Section 387. And, you know, it's just part of good process in a redundancy or in any other serious employment meeting, termination, and some disciplinary meetings as well. So that's a principle that we can apply across the board. So yeah, look, those 6 things I think are other factors that you would all assess in a redundancy process, and you know, certainly seeking advice on those things is can be very helpful.
Yeah, I think an important message out of that is businesses need to remember that redundancy processes are in fact terminations. They're a different type of termination, but they are termination processes. And the things like offering a support person and, you know, consultation and things of this nature, if you do some of these things wrong, there is a risk of unfair dismissal claims from an unfair redundancy. So I think that's really important. And before I sort of get into sharing with our audience who are considering or going through a restructuring process within their own business, how they can access a free consultation with On-Demand HR, is there anything else that you would like to add that you think might be valuable for those businesses that are going through a restructuring process?
Look, not really. I think that I think planning is important. I think just planning up front what you're going to do before you do it is important, and doing that a few weeks out from starting the process. I think if you're cobbling it together the last minute, I think that that's where I think mistakes happen. So I think having a good business rationale, first of all, and a business rationale doesn't have to be that we're losing money. It could be that we are creating more efficiencies. Just because a business is going well doesn't mean that all of the positions in that business are required. So that the first thing that businesses need to think about is, can we be more efficient? And if so, okay, we might decide to restructure. I mean, big corporations do it all the time. They restructure when they're making, you know, record profits and things like that. And that's all about efficiency, streamlining things. And the same logic should apply in small businesses as well. And that's obviously where, you know, On-Demand HR is very focused on small to medium enterprise and giving that same kind of degree of you know, business commerciality to a small business in a restructure as a large business would have.
No, that's sound words. And Clint, mate, thank you very much for spending your time and sharing some of your expertise today on the stream. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate it, mate.
Wrapping up today's session, please stick with us as I introduce some of the other On-Demand HR team members who are going to tell you a little bit about the free HR strategy session, which we think would be perfect for those of you that are going through a redundancy process or considering going through a redundancy process. Thanks very much, everyone, for tuning in, and looking forward to seeing you all next week.
Does your business currently have a HR or workplace relations issue?
Are you unsure how to work through compliance issues but still achieve a good business outcome?
Why not take advantage of On-Demand HR's free 30-minute online consultation with an experienced HR consultant?
At the end of the consultation, we also provide you with a strategic action plan to resolve your current issues.
To see the types of matters we can help with and to schedule your consultation, please visit ondemandhr.com.au/advice.
We look forward to delivering certainty, confidence, and clarity for your business in your HR and workplace relations affairs.